Hi everyone, and welcome to this next study log. And we're going to be talking about something really exciting today. We're going to be talking about the practice of making our data, our code, our materials open. And we're going to briefly touch upon why it's so important that we do that, and perhaps why it's not happened historically. And then we're going to move on to some of the kind of practical strategies and things to think about. So for those following this project, it will be super useful to see what we're going to be doing with things. And for those who might be doing other projects or projects of your own, you'll be able to hopefully apply some of these skills. So let's get straight into it. My name is Tom. I'm from the University of Greenwich, and I hope to give you today some useful information and a kind of more balanced understanding of the role of openness in our research materials, in our data, in our code, and the role that might have for improving the science that we do. We're going to also talk about the role of data management plans and talking about OSF, or the Open Science Framework, as a way of sharing research materials. By all means, not the most perfect solution, but a really useful way and platform to do so. We're also going to talk about some of the technicalities around this that I know makes some people a little nervous. So we're going to talk about licenses, and we're going to talk about the fair data principles to make sure that what we do is useful and correct. And really hoping that by the end of it, you'll have a little bit more confidence around how to share resources, materials for future projects. And I'm going to guide you through the process. So we start off with our major first question, which is, why do we need to share? Now, historically, sharing hasn't been a priority. So when you look at, for example, even if you're looking up a paper validating a new scale, sometimes the questions of the new scale aren't even in that paper. So we're trying to tell you that the data that this particular scale creates is particularly reliable or valid, but they don't even tell you the actual specific items on that scale. And obviously, that's massively problematic. But let's go back to our research cycle. So we know that there are a variety of key stages in this process, and predominantly it's a closed system. The only point at which we really have to open things up and share things is at the point of dissemination, and those with which we disseminate it aren't typically that bothered by the materials, the code, the data being openly accessible. And by that I mean that group is the academic publishers. Typically they're more interested in the narrative, the story you create from the data, and indeed, things like the p-values and whether they're statistically significant and novel and exciting, rather than the quality of the process. Now, obviously, we can only understand the quality of the process if we can see what's happened throughout. And this is where part of this kind of transparency around sharing data, code, and materials is really important, because only when we see the whole process can we provide an effective, efficient, confident evaluation of that. And then hopefully we can build upon it more easily, because there are things that are already set up and established for us to use. So when we think about the point of science as being a kind of slow step of accumulating and building knowledge to move forward to inform our practice, transparency is surely a massive key part of that. So we know there are massive issues across the research cycle. So we work in a closed system. Practices generally are suboptimal, and we have all sorts of issues around the lack of replication, because people want to publish novel and exciting ideas. We have hypotheses changing based on the results that are found, or harking. There's loads of particular issues, and they vary in how common they are. I know I've shown you this before, but I want to focus specifically on this latter stage around dissemination. Now, when we think of data sharing, this is incredibly rare, or has historically been rare. And to such an extent, people have tried to estimate to what extent have people made data available. And there is roughly about 70% failure to share data when people say data is available upon reasonable request, which should mean that data is available, often means data isn't really available. And this is really, really problematic for a variety of reasons. And one of which we're learning is around replication. and replicability. So can we reproduce the study and come to the same conclusion? Well, without having information about the materials and the way in which it was analysed, some of the detailed analysis, it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to produce a faithful reproduction. So we know that the replication crisis, started off by the open science collaboration, has indicated that we should be cautious about most results, right? So most things, most fields have areas which we shouldn't perhaps trust as much as we do, because the results don't replicate. So when we've used a similar sort of approach or technique to try and explore the same effect of interest, so the same hypothesis or the same effect of an intervention on a certain outcome, it tends not to be reporting the same results. So the first one here, the open science collaboration, tended to find effect sizes about half of that originally reported. So, for example, if I ran a workplace intervention trying to increase the number of positive interactions in the workplace, the original study would have claimed or found that it had a large effect, and so increased positive interactions by 4 times, perhaps. If I was to try and replicate that, it would, on average, tell me that it, in fact, increased it by 2 times, which is a very dramatic change. And so this understanding the scope of what kind of size of effect we can expect from different results is really important to know what to do in practice. And whilst many people have attributed this to psychology and said perhaps social sciences are a bit poor, I've provided a range of different fields here that demonstrate that the failure rate, whilst varying quite substantively, is relatively low for what you'd hope would be a robust, rigorous body of evidence. And so these odd practices that I noted across the research cycle, whether they be harking, p-hacking, or indeed not sharing data, leads us to concerns around the existing literature. And this has consequences for our trust. And what we know from a survey by Baker et al. Is that sharing does matter. So 2 of the key reasons why people think results don't replicate particularly well is because the code or the methods are unavailable and the raw data is not available. Okay, sharing is a problem. The failure to share data, code and materials to try and reproduce findings and try and verify existing conclusions. But also they can be used to do things like, for example, trying other analyses or approaches and working out whether the conclusions are the same, or using the resources to inform future studies. So, for example, informing sample size estimates through power analysis. There are loads of reasons why opening up these different resources, so code, study materials, data, is really, really useful. But historically, it hasn't happened. And this has really, I think, prevented us as a group of scientists to move forward with the pace at which would be optimal. Now, I want to highlight that this isn't a individual issue. This isn't because researchers are selfish or closed-minded or anything like that. We are working in a system where it's systemic. We are encouraged to go round this cycle as researchers as frequently as possible to try and get as many outputs as possible, so publications, grants, that sort of thing, because that's what the university values, right? That's what is appreciated and promoted based upon and gets more attention and all these sorts of things. So outcomes for us as researchers often come from this speedily moving around this research cycle as quickly as possible. And so that gives me concern that this isn't going to get better because the issue is systemic. And so, it's not individual researchers that are the problem. It's the whole system in which we work. It's funders, universities, publishers. All of these research stakeholders have a perspective and have a responsibility within this scope. And so I'm particularly passionate about looking at ways in which we can encourage and facilitate people to do more sharing and hopefully increase the speed with which we can make scientific developments. So we're going to focus now very specifically on data sharing, because the most research has been done in this particular area, looking at to what extent is data available, and how important that is. Let me share with you a few findings. We're going to go meta and review just a little bit of the existing literature. And what we know is data availability by journal or field does tend to vary quite dramatically. It tends to range from about 9% to 76%. Obviously, even anything below 100% is probably problematic. So this tells us something about how the scope of availability across fields. And one of the common ways to respond to data sharing is to say that data is available upon reasonable request. So you might see that 7-word phrase in any given published paper, and you might think, okay, fair enough, this person will share their data. Great. The issue is when you actually ask people to do so, when they've said that, you find that response rates are anywhere between 27 and 59%. And the chance of being completely ignored and not your request for reasonable request for data, typically ignored in about 14 to 41% of cases. So you've got a pretty good chance of being completely ignored. And obviously, a reasonable request is a reasonable request, and so should be fulfilled. We also, some really interesting research by Professor Whitshurst found that the reluctance to share data has been associated with weaker forms of evidence and higher prevalence of errors in the reporting of statistical results. So what that tells us is where people don't share things, it's often associated with there being inflated estimates of effects and or statistical errors. Now, that's not to say that people are not sharing because they've got something to hide. But if you think about it in the other direction, if you've got errors, you're not going to pick them up unless you also share the data. And so there's this kind of reinforcing culture around kind of issues being hidden. But if you want to flip it on the more positive side, what we do know also is that if you make things available and open like your data, it's associated with an increase in attention. And that attention comes in desirable forms if you're an academic. So it comes with citations, and that typically tends to be independent of things like journal impact factor, date of publication, and the author's country of origin. So for many reasons, we should share, but there are indeed many positive reasons. So what can we do if people don't share data? And don't share things? That's a valid concern. One way of dealing with this is to try and work out whether there are inconsistencies. This is where StatCheck comes in. It's a really interesting program, and it attempts to extract core results from PDFs, Word documents, whatever, and look at whether the p-values are consistent with the other numbers in the equation reported. So it typically does very basic things like t-tests and ANOVAs and correlations and these sorts of things. And what it does is it tries to recalculate it from the values it presents, and then works out and looks at whether the p-values are consistent with the reported recalculation. This is traditionally used as a kind of post hoc check. So rather than it being, part of the review process or part of a kind of evaluation of, me as an author checking that I've done and reported things correctly, it's typically done as a post-publication review. And it attempts to try and detect these sort of statistical errors. It is slowly increasing in use in terms of some journals use this as part of a kind of peer review process and built it into the system, but it's still relatively underutilized. So that's just one way of kind of tackling this issue. The other approach that I think is particularly interesting is what's known as the GRIM test, which is the granularity related inconsistency of means test. And this is a very basic way of explaining it, and it only really works with small sample sizes. But again, it attempts to work out whether numbers are feasibly possible purely on a statistical basis. So let's say we've got 12 undergraduates and we are capturing their age. So we can see here ranging from 17 to 26. And we've got a mean of 20.92. Okay, so that tells us quite a bit of useful information. Now, if somebody had their birthday, so we just changed one of those, so we changed that 17 to an 18, we see that the mean age changes from 20.92 to 21. And again, if somebody else had their birthday, it changes from 21.00 to 21.08. So we can see that the minimum difference between each mean score is 0.08. That must mean any mean age of 12 people, so if I have 12 participants, regardless of what sort of age categories we're targeting, that total should be divisible by 0.08 or a 12. Okay, and if it's not, then that tells us that perhaps that information is wrong, has been erroneously put there, it's a typo, a spelling mistake, or in fact has just been made up. Okay, so this tells us some quite useful information. So for example, a mean of 20.95 is not possible by being divided by 0.08. It just doesn't work. So that's completely impossible to have. Whereas, for example, a mean score of 20.33 is perfectly feasible. So that Grome test is a very simple way of looking at whether even basic statistics like the mean is feasible given the sample size. But that only really works with small ones. And part of the reason why I think this is helpful but not really going to touch the sides is that even researchers themselves tell us that there are lots of issues in research, and even with their own projects. And this was a really interesting project where they looked at loss of confidence and how researchers lost their confidence in their previous findings. So what do we do? How do we move forward? So we know researchers lose confidence in their own findings for a variety of reasons, and that data sharing and generally sharing is problematic. So what can we do? One suggestion is to share. One answer is to say, let's share everything we've got, data, materials, processes. Let's share as much as we can, and hopefully that will help people do better in future. And whilst this has been part of an incredibly influential movement, often called kind of open science, open scholarship, open research, anything like that, this has also come with a lot of concerns, and justifyingly so, because as soon as you change or try to change a culture, what you get is resistance. And so this resistance has come under the form of lots of different assumptions. So quite a few here. The first is that data should always be open, that, there's no reason why you can't have open data. Now, clearly this isn't true, right? There are obvious reasons why data shouldn't be open sometimes. Sometimes it's a legal matter. So, for example, as an occupational psychologist, I might be working with an organization's data that they have not given me permission to share. So clearly that would be wrong to share. And there are a variety of other reasons. For example, if it risks people being identified, if the data is particularly sensitive, all of these things are important to reflect upon. So the general premise or term adopted here is open as is possible, as closed as is necessary. So we share as much as we possibly can, but close that or don't share that which we have to. And it's always kind of different for all projects. So we should be making these sorts of decisions on a project by project basis, acknowledging that some progress is better than none in terms of sharing. So if we do share some, that's better than sharing nothing. The second idea or assumption is that data sharing is not suitable for qualitative or non-statistical research. Again, not necessarily grounded in evidence, this claim. There is a number of real valid reasons why we might want to encourage sharing of qualitative data. For example, if it's not in a non-sensitive area or the participants would be practically impossible to identify, then that would be really useful information to allow things like secondary data analyses, but also to look at, for example, what particular lens, and when we consider reflexivity within qualitative research, what particular lens and approach has somebody taken to this data, and is that a fair way of looking at it if you were to for example, take a different perspective? Or it helps to establish confidence in our findings and in our approach, in our process. And obviously I've spoken a lot about the process of research being important, not just the outputs. Some people say you should share everything and that it's not good enough to share partial data. Again, as I discussed, it's sometimes really useful to share this. So if you're concerned, for example, that the demographic information people provide might identify people, then share all the data you can apart from the demographic information. So, for example, without somebody's data, sex, ethnicity, age, for example, and that removes any possibility of concern. And you can always put the larger data set somewhere more protected and gatekeepered that can still be accessed upon request. There's concerns that sharing data leads to critical evaluation and judgments made about you as an individual. So, for example, that people might find flaws in your research, or people might think that what you've done is sloppy or not particularly great research. As far as much as I've seen within this community and within this literature, there are very few examples of people being caught out, judged, or other discriminated upon for data sharing. These are few and far between. So I don't see that as a massive concern. And equally, it should be part of the research process that somebody can critically evaluate the data you present. Obviously, I don't approve of any individual attacks based on that, but I do encourage a critical approach to every part of the research process, and that does involve the materials, the coding, etc. And finally, what I think is where we're at now in terms of where our norm is at. We've understood, and I think most researchers now understand they have to share things, and that sharing is generally good practice. But what's not necessarily accepted is how to do that and what represents good practice. And so a lot of people think if I just send you my Excel file, or I send you a Word doc, that's enough. And that's enough to be open. Whereas what we know is without any metadata, so data about the data, any contextual information, without knowing the processes applied to this, without a code book or a data dictionary to tell me what each column is in each spreadsheet, it really actually doesn't add anything. It's got to be accessible. It's got to be usable. And this is where FAIR principles come in shortly. So I'm going to briefly go through now the research cycle once more, but looking at how we can design your study to embed sharing within it from the start. So for those engaging with this project, you can see what I've done at each stage to kind of facilitate that. And you can also reflect upon it for your own practices for other research projects too. So the first stage in our process is kind of this idea that we have to design a study. And what I'm hoping to do is help encourage people to make very small changes throughout these parts of the research process, hopefully to encourage people to engage with this practice. So when we're designing a study, we first might want to consider a lot of different questions. So what type of data am I going to collect and how? Is it possible for, and do I want the data to be publicly available? And should that be in any way mediated by, for example, a gatekeeper? Does it need cataloguing? Is it actually genuinely useful data that other people can use? I imagine the answer is yes there. What of the data I plan to collect would be most valuable to share? And equally, you might want to flip that. What might be most problematic to share? And see if they're the same thing. If they're not, great. Because you can imagine to be sharing at least some of that. What might identify individuals? One of the great concerns around sharing data is that you might identify might identify a participant who has then disclosed a lot of sensitive information about themselves. So what can I do to limit that? So what might identify people in this particular sample, and thus what should I not include? So, for example, if I was working with professors in higher education, I wouldn't want to, for example, report at an individual basis ethnicity and field of study, because there are so few professors from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in each different field that it would probably be quite obvious who was recruited even through those two very basic pieces of information. So I might want to think about, what's the most appropriate to share. I should also be thinking about where do I want the data to be stored. So is there a particular community that might make best use of that data? So does it have particularly useful pedagogical kind of purposes or secondary research value if it's, for example, a big project with lots and lots of data? And what else would I have to do or share to make the data make sense to anybody else who might want to access it? And this process of considering data throughout this whole design is typically captured by what's known as a data management plan. And this is, in essence, a document that outlines what data you'll be collecting, what will be shared, how. And it's designed to provide a clear roadmap towards, or to encourage you and facilitate and support you to create that data, to manage that data, and then to preserve that data. And it's typically now requested by research funders, so it's becoming a more and more common skill that's needed for research. And it, interestingly, it not only focuses on the data itself, but also the metadata. So, for example, which questions were used to initiate responses, when was the data collected, by who, all this sort of broader information. And they really do vary in terms of how much detail they request. Some are far more detailed than others. I obviously quite like that level of detail, but it often depends on what type of project you have. So I've provided you with a number of links here to examples of data management plans, because I think they're actually really useful to reflect upon what are the common features that are required for data management, and then what are the kind of things that are really important to share or to plan for. So once you've designed your study and thought about what data you're going to create and how you're going to share that, it's probably worth thinking about ethics. And so I've got a variety of kind of standard comments and things I add to, for example, the participant information sheets. I do a lot of research doing basic experimental questionnaire-based designs, and I tend to use these sorts of statements to facilitate that sharing. And I think what's important here particularly is that the participants themselves are aware of what you are sharing and with who and when. And the metaphor I like to use around this idea is this of using a potato in cooking, right? You have raw data, which is, downloaded straight from Qualtrics or straight from your Excel file. And that's like your raw potato dug out of the ground. What you then might do is peel it. So you might do some processing of that data to make it easier to use. Then you might cut it up into chunks. So you've got an even more processed data, ready for analysis, total scores created, whatever that is. And then you might even have another form. So where you've, roasted it in the oven, or you've mashed it and turned it into mashed potato, whatever it is. And that is more of a ready to share, more crafted version of the data file. And it's important to think about who is going to have access and how you're going to share all these different pieces of the potato, as it were. So I always encourage my students or within all my research projects to be really explicit to participants about what it is exactly I'll be doing with their data. So, for example, here it will be around differentiating between the final data set, which will be anonymized and stored on the OSF or other such place, or whether it'll be what exactly I'll be doing with it to get it to that point. So, for example, looking through open-ended questions to take away any information that might identify participants. Obviously, storing it in safe places until I do publicly make it available, and then deleting the original raw data. If I've got, for example, the peeled potato, I no longer need the peel. I no longer need the skin of the potato, so that can go. So it's really useful to think around that. And indeed, for this project we're all working on, this is what I've stated about this in the ethics form, which is that the data will be stored on a OneDrive account. This is my university's preferred choice of data storage. That it will be checked to ensure no identifying information is presented, because we do collect some open-ended responses, for example, whether people are in employment and for how long and these sorts of things. So they could write, my name is Terry Jones and whatever. What we then do, everything we get given from participants, excluding any identifying information, but including all demographic information, will be shared via the OSF page, where it will be made permanently available for anybody and everybody to see, publicly available. The original raw data files will all be permanently deleted as soon as the tidied data, the anonymized data is shared, and to also highlight that open data is becoming standard and that it follows all the principles of the Data Protection Act and GDPR, which everybody likes to get all worked up about when we think about sharing stuff. So hopefully that's useful to reflect upon. What can we do then during data collection to facilitate this notion of sharing? Here we are. So what could we do? If we're doing quantitative studies, we could do these sorts of things. So we could verbally brief or debrief participants in addition to writing down whatever it is in the form. We could make explicit statements about what will or will not be shared. Refine consent forms, as I just have, to encourage explicit agreement. Share with participants an example of what and how the data will be shared. And so if you use, for example, mock data, which I do for this program, you can see that in the OSF page that what the public will be able to see of your data, and to share details of the eventual home. So if they do want to then subsequently go and have a look, they can do. And so I've added this comment in red explicitly into my consent form, which I think is particularly explicit. I agree to allow all the data I provide, excluding any potentially identifying information which will be removed, to be openly shared online and thus publicly accessible. And I think that definitely is an explicit acknowledgement of what will happen. But what happens if you haven't got quantitative data and you've got non-statistical data? What could you do? Now, people often consider making qualitative data open more problematic because it considers the amount of kind of detail and potential sensitive information that people share. What I encourage everybody to think about is to be explicit and transparent about that use before and after the data collection. So at the start, before whatever process you use to collect data, and indeed afterwards. And to consider some of these questions. So, for example, have you considered adding questions to ensure that the participant understands what part of their data will be made available and where it will go? Reminding participants that is the process. So after your interview, after your process, after the study is completed, reiterating to them, we're going to be making this data available. You can run through protocols you'll implement to de-identify data, make a little video showing what you do, perhaps. Decide upon a pseudonym and other such details to replace sensitive information. So when I'm doing interviews, one of the first questions I ask is, when I later look at your data, I'll be removing your real name. What should I put down as your pseudonym or fake name? And, if it's about an organization or a particular group, I might say, what should we call them instead? They tend to enjoy that. It's quite fun. Negotiate what can be shared about demographic details explicitly. So say, are you happy for me to refer to you as a 38-year-old white man or whatever it is? Remind participants at the end of the data collection why, when, or how their data will be shared. It's just good practice. Provide participants with documents that are intended to be shared to ensure they're happy with all the details made openly available. And this is obviously particularly where it's especially sensitive to go, this is what I'm hoping to share with people. Are you still happy with this? Is a really good way to negotiate that situation and have that kind of two-way discussion. And finally, returning to participants with questions about what they feel comfortable sharing is also really good practice. So we've talked about data predominantly, but there's lots of things to consider when sharing. So what can we share? Where do we share it? And all the variety of different good practices and principles that have started popping up as sharing has become more common. The first question is, what do we share? Now, I'd like to think that if I understood a whole research process in much more detail, I'd know what to take from that study with much more confidence. So I share absolutely everything in relation to my projects, just to give that level of transparency and encourage criticality. So it starts off with ethics applications, so anything from what process I use to collect ethical approval and things like consent form, debrief, and these sorts of things. Procedures and materials, so anything I gave participants as part of the process or anything I adopted to create those materials. Pre-registration, as we've previously discussed, I think is a really useful thing to share and openly provide. Data, whether that's raw, processed, mock data. Analysis scripts. So as we'll come on to in the next video, I do a lot of research using R and RStudio, which is a coding-based software where you write code rather than point and click. And that means I can reproduce the findings much more easily. So we have these analysis scripts that I can share. Study reports, presentations, preprints, basically any outputs from the study we can also share. And so hopefully it being all in one place where everybody can see everything to do with the study gives people the ability to really deep dive into it and get a more critical awareness and understanding of what happened. The next question then, I guess, is where do I share this all? Or where is a good place? So I encourage everybody who hasn't yet tried this sort of thing to use the Open Science Framework. And this is a really, really good place to start. There's loads of field-specific depositories and things like that. But the OSF is to some extent protected for a decent amount of time where it can make everything available, and it is super easy to use. So you've probably all seen this, the project page for our project, and you can see here in the middle there's a variety of folders and documents, and basically everything to do with the project is here. So anybody can check it out and see what's been going on. I encourage everybody to do this, and if you're in any way worried about that, my recommendation is to check out this paper, which is a guide to how to use the OSF and to how to explicitly to share data. And it really is a very, very useful tutorial. And I should also acknowledge the journal itself, Advances in Methods and Practices in Psychological Science, or AMPPS, is exceptional. There is so much useful, many useful papers in there, tutorials, really interesting replication projects. Basically, I think it's the only journal I've ever read pretty much everything that's been published in. Let's be honest, we don't read through journals like magazines, flicking through each page, and every article is super interesting. This journal is as close as I've got to that. So that's as good as an endorsement. That's what I'll say about it. Okay, so one of the core things around sharing is people worried that they might get scooped. People might use their data for other purposes, things like that. And what we can apply is licenses, which help kind of limit that. So you can have a variety of combinations of these symbols to help decide or limit who has access or how open is it. So clearly, for example, you can limit whether people have to attribute you and say it was originally developed by whoever or not. And that's, I guess, one of the most basic kind of ways of kind of considering what to do with your data. And then it gets to more complicated things of, do you want to allow it for non-commercial use, for commercial use? Are you allowing people to play with it and create a different version of it and do stuff with that too, or not? Etc. So you can see on the right-hand side here that it's kind of a sliding scale of what you add to limit use of the data. And there's another infographic here that might help that too. So you can do lots of different kind of things to it to help manage these concerns if you are particularly worried that it might be sensitive, but not in a way of identifying people, but just, you don't want it to be misused or misattributed. You can always control that. Okay, so that's a kind of helpful process to think through, and certainly do read up about it if you're interested and use the tool. The Creative Commons tool is a particularly useful one to see what is probably most appropriate for your data by asking a few questions. So that's super interesting too. The final, or one of the other kind of additions to consider is, what do you share? And as an editor for a number of journals, I've had lots of interesting discussions encouraging people to share data, and as much of it as possible, and people saying basically, I'll share some of it. And is that good enough? So you may want to consider what you can share. So you can share mock data, so made up data that hopefully has the, you can run through code and check that the code itself works, and you can, for example, if you make a questionnaire in Qualtrics, you can make it create some mock data, and that helps you kind of inform your analysis process and coding, so it's a bit more foolproof. You have raw data, so without touching it exactly how it comes in. Then you have processed data, so you might have tidied it up in certain ways. You may have de-identified data to make sure you can't identify participants. You might have synthetic data, and this video by Dan Quintana is particularly interesting if you haven't heard of this before. In essence, it mimics the qualities of the original data set, but no single line of data represents a real individual. So there's no risk of disclosure or anything like that. But it preserves both the statistical properties of the given question or scale, but also the relationships between scales or relationships between variables. So it can be really useful to kind of consider. And then finally, you've got metadata. So you've got data about the data. And again, that provides useful context for what's going on and how this data was collected. So it's really useful to consider what type of sharing is going to be possible, what version of your data file is worth sharing. So is it sensitive? If not, you could probably share the raw data. Do you have lots of processing of data to make it meaningful? If so, perhaps you could share both the raw and the processed data so people can see that your processing of the data is consistent and fair. You can do lots of, perhaps they might identify some errors that way. You can do lots of different things. One thing I think is particularly useful to share alongside data is what's known as a code book or a data dictionary. And so, for example, we have, and lots of people used to work with SPSS, you've got a variable that's called sex, and you've coded it 0 and 1 to mean male and female, or female and male. Which one is it? And that causes lots of questions, concerns, and inconsistencies. Now, you could label your variable as sex, M for male equals 1. But what if you have loads of different categories? That's not going to be useful because you don't want to have variables with names, as long as whatever. So what can you do? So what you might want to do is provide this sort of code book or data dictionary, and that shows you basically more information. So this is a very basic example from scale scored data. It was secondary analysis. So I made a very brief code book just to make it that little bit more accessible, to show you what the variables were, what the time points were, and hopefully that made things a little bit more obvious. Whereas some other projects, you might want more detailed information around what it is exactly that each particular number refers to. Okay, moving on. So we know that sharing data is useful and that we should share it alongside other information. Now, there has been good practice established in this sort of sharing behaviour, and it's typically referred to as the fair data principles, ensuring that it's not good enough just to be open. You have to also consider these other kind of contextual factors. And so it's whether the data is findable, it's accessible, whether it's interoperable, aka can I use it with different software systems, processes, and is it reusable? Is it likely to be and stay somewhere? So this is a very fun cartoon, but if you want the more strict formalized version, this is it. And as you can see, if you work through them, it is actually quite a considerable effort to ensure that your data does conform to these fair data principles. It is not the same as throwing a file on an OSF page or whatever. It is actually really thinking about all these different kind of aspects of the process. Now, you may be saying, Tom, that's all very well and good, but my sort of field or my sort of data isn't suitable for sharing at all, or suitable for sharing with the public. So what can I do? Well, my request is that instead of thinking nothing is possible, consider other versions of sharing. So this was a really interesting paper by Bird et al. From 2020. Think about whether embargoes or gatekeeping might be useful, because what you have now is this system of a clique sharing, which is people share with who they want to. And typically you'll see sharing happens within groups. and across, well-established friendships, but tends not to happen to individuals outside of groups. So typically the reality is currently the bottom two images. People make requests for data when people say that it is available upon reasonable request, and whether people will respond to it or not, hit or miss, that's up to them. What we might want to consider is whether, and so obviously when we use the OSF or other such places, we're using this first form, the top left, this kind of public data sharing process. We don't immediately have to share data, so if it is particularly time sensitive, we might want to consider an embargo where, for example, the data is closed for however many months and then it is made openly available after that, and that period of sensitivity has passed. Another way of mitigating this is through controlled access sharing. So we have some sort of centralized repository, but we have a committee who basically determines who gets access, who is approved access, and who doesn't. And this can be really useful, again, if it's a particularly sensitive or influential data set, that there is some independent individuals deciding what is fair and just use of the data. Something to think about, at least. One other thing to mull over finally in this kind of during the study kind of process is to consider what you do around the raw data. So, and what you do with sharing data. What do you consider to be a safe space and safe place for your data? And this, you have to consider all sorts of things like institutional access, privacy, likelihood of access loss. There's loads of different reasons why you might think that a certain place is suitable or unsuitable for data sharing. So I encourage you to think more widely about this. Just because there is for example, a university approved process, it doesn't mean that it's actually effective for the particular population you're interested in. Now, finally, there are a few things that you might want to consider around the whole study process, the whole research cycle. So after you have finished your study and you've collected your data and you've essentially disseminated, what happens next? How do you make the most out of having your data, your code, your materials shared? One way to do this is to think about whether you can cite and make your data citable. This is one of the easiest things you can do, and basically as long as it has a DOI, it's therefore citable, and therefore you can see how it's being used, you can track impact, these sorts of things. So you can do this using separate repositories like Figshare, or publishing the data file within a component on the OSF page to get a separate DOI. So you can see it on here. You can create a particular DOI and things like that if you want to. So this is really useful. You can track where your data is being used, and it gives you a chance to have it acknowledged, because in of itself, not just designing a whole study, but creating and curating data in of itself is a big process, and you should be acknowledged and rewarded for that. You might want to consider for any projects what you want to be able to do to make your data citable and trackable. So you can start by making your OSF page public, making a separate component for the data and making sure it's citable. But you may want to also consider other things, such as where do I want my data to be accessed from in 10 years, 20 years? What's going to happen? Where could I and should I share the data to ensure its longevity? And I have no simple answers. Unfortunately, this completely depends on your field, your subjective expertise, and who your particular audience of interest is, who's going to make the most of this open data. Finally, you might want to consider acknowledging that the data you've produced, created, and supported is in of itself a useful outcome from the research process, and publishing it as such. So, heads up a very explicit conflict of interest. I'm co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Open Psychology Data, and there we publish papers all about data that has high potential for reuse. And so this is a particularly cool thing that you can do. You can write a paper describing how you collected the data and what it might be useful for, and that in of itself might be a useful research outcome. Obviously, I'm not going to do it for this paper, for this project, because a bit of a conflict of interest. But it's something really you should really consider, because again, for the reasons it's useful to have to be able to cite your data, to be able to have a place to say, this is what the data is, this is where it is, and this is how I created it. This is all the methodological decisions I made, and this is all really useful information. And often you get checks to make sure it complies with, for example, the FAIR data principles and things like that. So it can be a really, really useful process to follow, and obviously can subsequently facilitate citations and other such scholarly acknowledgement. So that's also a really cool way to go forward too. So that is it for my summary of openness in terms of data, code and materials. We'll talk more about code next time, where we're going to look at the ways in which I'm going to tidy and analyze the data, and I'll give you a quick run through of the core processes. But I really hope this has been useful to think about why is it important that we share, and then how do we share? Because there are so many complexities associated with sharing, and I think most people get quite worried about that. But actually, there's lots that we can do that's within our control as individual researchers to contribute to a more progressive and accumulating understanding. And transparency and sharing is going to be a key part of that process. So I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time when we're going to be looking at data cleaning and data analysis. I'll look forward to seeing you then. Take care.